glad that you guys are here. We are in a series, actually wrapping up a series today called Iceberg. And the whole thing about this series has been, it's sort of tackling what's beneath the surface, the stuff that we don't want to deal with, the stuff that we often push down, the stuff that it's sort of our real self that's maybe underneath, and covered up, but we sort of protect what's above and what everyone can see. And so we've been challenging you over this series to actually take that stuff that's under the surface and actually bring it up and let's begin dealing with it. Let's begin talking about those things. And I actually ran across a quote from Freud, of all people. And this is what he said. He said, "Unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and come forth later in uglier ways." Right? Like zombie feelings, right? Is basically what he said. They get buried alive and they come back in these ugly ways that we never anticipated. And that's really why we're dealing with this. And this is sort of the issue, the thing that we're trying to get at. We're trying to understand, how do we deal with our emotions and these things in healthy ways so that they don't come up, down the line in some really ugly kinds of ways. And so I hope this has been helpful for you as we've talked through this. Last week I just thought was so powerful where Joel talked a little bit about grief and loss. And he said, all of us are going to experience loss. Like that's unavoidable. But how we deal with it and whether or not we grieve about it is really a choice that we get to make. And so he challenged us to really go back and to grieve the losses that we've experienced in our life so that we don't have those things kind of in us just waiting to erupt later on. And today I want to talk about a similar concept where it's unavoidable, but our choice is kind of how we deal with it. And that's the issue of conflict. I want to talk this morning just about how we deal with conflict, because conflict is unavoidable, right? Like we all deal with it all the time. Your week is filled with conflict, right? From the person who gets your order wrong to maybe a harsh conversation or whatever you want to call it with your spouse, right? A fight, whatever that is, to, really maybe something with your boss at work or there's a budget meeting or someone cuts you off in traffic or whatever it is. Conflict kind of rears its ugly head all the time throughout our week. And we sort of have a choice about how we're going to deal with conflict. And some of those conflicts are deeper. Some of them are bigger. They're family members who did something, or their betrayal of a friend, or they're things like that. They're maybe massive. And other times it's just minor little things. But all of it matters. And we got to deal with it, and we got to learn how to deal with it in the best kinds of way so that we don't have issues later on down the line. And so here's the thing. There's probably one of 5 ways that we all sort of tend to handle conflict. And they're, maybe obvious to you, but probably 5 different things that we do. The first one is that we sometimes escalate. And so, something minor happens and we just kind of rev it up a notch, right? We take it to the next level. We push it back on somebody like 1 + 1, right? And then it comes back at us +1. And it just kind of keeps going back and forth. Sometimes we withdraw, and this is probably what most of us tend to do, because none of us loves well, I won't say none of us loves conflict. Most of us don't love conflict, right? And so what do? We avoid it. Like if we know it's there, we withdraw. We go away from it, right? We don't want any part of it. Some of us attack. And so if there's the slightest bit of conflict, we're going to go at you. We're going for the jugular, right? Like we want to win this thing. We're going for it. And sometimes that's what we do. Now, other times we just assume things that really aren't even true. So somebody does something and we start building a case about, oh man, their heart in the matter, right? Like they hate me and they've always hated me. And it was all, we start building this thing and it's their plan to get me fired or whatever. And we build the thing and it's like, all they knew is that they were reading something and they walked past you. They didn't even think about it, but like you built this whole thing up, right? About it, and we sometimes do that. The last one, which is probably also really common, is that we triangulate, or what we do is we have a conflict with this person here, but then we go to that person over there to try and deal with it. Right? And we go tell them, or we go tell that group of people, and we sort of build a case against that person or whatever it is that we do. And so these are all sort of different ways that we handle conflict, probably none of which is really good, none of which is really healthy. And so I want to talk through this morning what we ought to be able to do in order to handle conflict in the best ways possible. So here's a great verse. It's in Romans chapter 12. And this is God's take on this whole conflict thing. And here's what he says. He says, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. And then listen to this. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Okay? So there's two sort of disclaimers there. If it is possible, and as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Okay? So do whatever you can do to make sure that you're at peace with the people around you. And there's all kinds of different teachings in the Bible about this. I mean, we talked a few weeks ago here at Story Church about Peter, a friend of Jesus, who came to him one time and said, Jesus, how many times should I forgive my brother, my friend who sins against me? And Peter thought he was saying a lot, right? Like 7 times, And Jesus kind of blew him away with this response, like, no, like infinite number, like a huge amount, right? And then there's this time where Jesus teaches us how to pray. His disciples ask him one time, they say, how should we pray? And Jesus goes through this prayer, which you've probably heard or you've heard of. It's called the Lord's Prayer, and it starts, our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. But right in the middle, it says, forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. Or forgive us our trespasses as we have forgiven those who trespass against us. So it's this, like, God, would you do for me what I am already doing for other people? Which is not usually the case, let's be honest, right? It's like, God, forgive me, but I don't really want to forgive that person. And so Jesus teaches us to pray for the things that we are already doing. So if we're in the business of building peace in our lives and forgiving people, then we can ask God, would you do that for me too? Would you forgive me? Would you make me at peace with you? And so that's just some of the backdrop of what the Bible says, but I want to teach this morning specifically from one passage where Jesus really lays out for us, this is how you handle conflict. This is the way that we should do it. It's a step-by-step kind of process, and you don't often get this in the Bible. A lot of times, you kind of have to interpret things, but Jesus really kind of gives us a list here, like first do this, and then do that, and then do that. And it's really kind of unusual, so it must be important, and it must be something that you and I can learn from. And so the passage is actually found in Matthew chapter 18. If you want to read the whole thing, you can read that sometime and go there. But we're going to just focus on a few verses from Matthew 18. And Matthew is this friend of Jesus who wrote an eyewitness account of what it was like to be with Jesus. And 4 different people did this: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they're called the Gospels. And so these 4 guys who spent time with Jesus for 3 years every single day, they eventually wrote down the stories, and they wrote down what it was like, and they wrote down his teachings. And this is one of those cases where Matthew tells us exactly what Jesus said when it comes to handling conflict. And so here's what he says in Matthew 18, beginning in verse 15. He says, if your brother or sister sins against you, go and point out their fault just between the 2 of you. Okay, so let's stop right there for a second. If your brother or sister sins against you, go and point out their fault just between the 2 of you. So the first thing that you need to understand is that healthy conflict happens face to face. Healthy conflict happens face to face. Right now, already I know some of you are getting sweaty palms, even thinking about that, right? The fact that you would have to go to someone and look them in the eyes and have a difficult conversation about how they wronged you, or they did something that you didn't like, or they hurt your feelings, or whatever it is. And we don't like to do that. And most of us are immediately defaulting to one of those other 5 things, right? Like, we're going to get mad, we're going to withdraw, we're going to do all these kinds of things. But Jesus says, no, listen. The very first thing you do, if someone has wronged you, if someone has hurt you, that you go to them face to face, and you point out the fault. You have a hard discussion. You say, hey, it may not have been on purpose, but yesterday when you said that, or when you gave me that look, or when you whatever, that bothered me, that hurt me, right? Like, that was difficult. Like, I don't really like how that went down. So you have the difficult conversation, and you enter into that face to face. And here's what happens when Jesus talks about handling conflict. Jesus' method actually brings people together. Right? Whereas most of the time, the ways that we handle conflict actually drives us apart. Jesus says, no, we're going to handle conflict by bringing people together. There's an example of this in the New Testament where this guy Paul actually goes to his friend Peter and confronts him face to face. Because Peter was this leader of the church, And he sort of held to these older ideas that were frankly racist. He was saying like only Jews, should live a certain way, and if you're not a Jew, well then you should probably become a Jew first in order to do this. And Paul goes to him and confronts him about it. And he goes right to his face and he says, this isn't right. Like, why are you acting this way around the Jewish people, and then you're acting this way around the Gentiles? And he goes and he confronts him face to face. And this is so important that this happens between two people. There's immediate conversation that happens. I'll never forget one of my first lessons in leadership as a junior high pastor in California when I was working there. I had a large group of junior high students, and it was chaos. I mean, it was just chaos. Like, the kids were nuts. They were, I pulled, there were fights. I pulled knives off of people. I mean, it was crazy, okay? We were having a lot of fun. There was a lot of, people that were coming, but it was intense. And the volunteers who came into that environment, the adult leaders, some were college students, some were parents. They were a little overwhelmed, to say the least, at times. And there was a particular night where I was teaching, and it was just chaotic, and people were, kids were talking and doing different things. I remember one leader who just kind of out of frustration got up and walked across the room, like in the middle of the room, and like grabbed this kid or sat next. I can't even remember exactly what she did, but sort of dealt with the thing, like right there publicly, right in front of everyone. And I remember it bugged me, like as a junior high pastor, as a young kid, because to me, like I just cared about that kid so much, and I was worried if he was embarrassed or all these different kinds of things. And I remember like the way this person dealt with it was difficult. Like, I didn't like it. But it was a mom of a kid in our group, and frankly, I was like 21 years old, and I was intimidated. I was just overwhelmed by that whole idea. And so rather than going to her and having that conversation, I made an executive decision to write a letter that I would send to the entire youth ministry staff about a hypothetical situation that literally just happened like the night before, right? And so I went and I wrote, I was like, just a reminder, blah, 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 and if you ever, and this is how we should deal with that and whatever. Well, of course, she got the letter, and what did she do as a mature adult? She came right to me, right, with the letter. She's like, is this about me? I'm like, no, why do you think that? And so, we had this hard conversation, but only because she initiated it, and I was a coward. I was like, no, I don't want to deal with that. And so I just kind of blanket statement this thing, and instead of going to her one-on-one and saying, hey, that's not really how I want to handle that situation. And so this is sometimes what we do. But healthy conflict happens face to face. Now the verse goes on, after he says, if your brother or sister sins against you, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. He then says, if they listen to you, you have won them over. Okay, if they listen to you, you have won them over. Now here's the second thing. Healthy conflict has the goal of restoration. Okay? Healthy conflict is about making the relationship whole again. So now, like, a lot of times we think of conflict as like one side proving to be stronger or greater than the other. And it's this idea that I'm going to be right, or I'm going to get my way, or I'm going to get revenge, or whatever that might be. But healthy conflict, the way that Jesus describes it, healthy conflict actually restores relationships. It brings people back together. If they listen, you've won them over. Like, you've got your friend back, right? You've got that relationship is made whole again. And in fact, just by experience, I can tell you that the people that I've had difficult conversations with at times, I mean, those relationships end up becoming stronger often because there's a level of honesty that we've reached with each other that we didn't have before. Like, before, we were kind of pretending we were above the surface, right? But when we start to handle the conflict, we go deeper in our relationships with one another, and we really get at, hey, here's how I took that. Here's how I understood that. Here's the way that I think about those things. And all of a sudden, we're past the weather and all kinds of lame conversations, and we're really getting to our hearts, and we're beginning to connect at a deeper level. And if we're willing to do it, then what happens is that our relationships actually get stronger, and there's restoration that happens. And so, healthy conflict happens face to face, and then healthy conflict has the goal of restoration. But then Jesus goes on, and here's what he says. So what do you do then, right? Like, if that still didn't work, here's what he says. If they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And if they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector, which I'll explain that in just a second. But here's the idea that I want you to understand, that healthy conflict is generous with forgiveness. Okay? It's generous with second chances and third chances and fourth chances. What happened in this situation is Jesus said, first you go to them face to face. And listen, 9 times out of 10, when you'll have a difficult conversation, it ends right there. Like, oh, okay, now we have an understanding. Like, now we're okay. And so most often, you don't need these other steps. Most often, if we'll just have the courage to have one difficult conversation, we don't have to have more. Like, it's dealt with in that moment. But what happens is, on occasion, that doesn't solve it, that doesn't fix the thing. And so Jesus says, then take 2 or 3, or actually 1 or 2, it says, with you. 1 or 2 friends along, people, and what are these people's role? They're sort of the mediator. They're the person who's there to kind of help guide things, to be a witness, to make sure everyone's getting their heart across, everyone's getting to say what they need to say. And there's this, sometimes you just need outside help, right? Sometimes in a conversation or a relationship, it's just, there's a lot there. And so you just need someone who's not really emotionally invested in the situation, who can help you sort of talk through that and help sort of point out, okay, maybe that's not quite fair, or maybe, you just listen for a second, let them say everything they need to say, right? And those other people are in the room to just help, again, with the goal of restoration. Their goal is to help bring the thing together. So it's not go and get 1 or 2 people to join your team to go attack this person, right? It's get 1 or 2 people who can come and to help in this conversation, to help bring about the goal of restoration. And this is so important for us to be able to do. And then he says, listen, if it still doesn't get resolved, then it says, listen, if these people, and this is assuming a culture where everybody is religious and a part of this religious culture of the Jews. He says, take it to the church, take it to the leaders of the sort of spiritual institution to help guide through this process. So first it's face to face, then it's take a couple of friends, and then it's go to the sort of spiritual authority to help work through the situation. And then he says, then still, if they don't listen, if they still aren't willing to reconcile, then he says to take the step to treat them as a pagan or a tax collector. Now, that needs a little bit of unpacking. Okay, what the idea there is, and again, you got to understand the culture this is written into. The entire culture is built around this sort of, religious life of the community. They all do things together, and there's festivals, and there's ways of worship, and there's a pattern to their week, and there's all these different things that they're doing because of their faith. Now, what happens when you close somebody out of that? Suddenly, their whole, everything about their life is affected. And why would you do that? Because, again, what that will do is it will make the strongest statement possible to this person that I am going to do whatever it takes to reconcile, even if it means kind of shutting you out for a moment until you feel the weight of that so that we can then reconcile. Again, the whole goal is reconciliation. It's not like stiff arm them for the rest of your life. It's exclude them from the religious life of the community so that they will be forced into a place of going, okay, I better deal with this. I better have the conversation, right? And so Jesus actually, that's the 4th step away from where he starts. And that's, a lot of times, we want to immediately stiff arm people, and we just want to push them away, get out of my life, all this kind of stuff. But Jesus is like, no, go face to face. Then take some people with you, right? And then go to your church and allow someone in a spiritual authority to help through that process. And only after all these things do we then, carefully cut them out of a religious community's life so that they will be drawn back in, right? Now, this is hard to translate in our culture because our culture does not surround itself and we're not all committed to a religious life in a community the way that these people were. So, even in a modern day scenario, I don't know exactly what that looks like, to be honest. I just know that directly after this teaching, just in case you were to think that Jesus is advocating just shunning people, directly after this teaching is Jesus goes right into the parable of the unmerciful servant, which we talked about here a couple of weeks ago, which is where Jesus tells a story about a man who is forgiven a huge debt by his master, a servant forgiven by his master, a debt he could have never possibly repaid. And then he goes right out from there and he takes a fellow servant who owes him a few bucks and he holds that debt against him and actually has the guy thrown in prison. And ultimately, Jesus is commenting on our need to be able to forgive one another no matter what because of the great debt that we have all been forgiven. And so Jesus, gives us this, here's how to handle conflict, but then he goes right into a teaching that basically says, what business do we have to hold anything against anyone because we've been forgiven so much? And so, all I know is that in our culture, where maybe it doesn't work exactly the same as it did then, our goal should always be reconciliation, forgiveness. And sometimes you need time, sometimes you need space, but ultimately the goal is at some point, we've got to get back on the same page together. Unhealthy conflict creates space. And as we've been talking about this iceberg thing, what happens is when we fail to deal with our conflict, we basically push it under the surface. And what happens is that sort of adds to the iceberg that's underneath. And eventually that grows and it grows and it grows. And pretty soon there is so much ice between me and you that you couldn't possibly get close, right? You can't get any closer than this barrier that I've created between us because of unhealthy conflict and things that I've refused to deal with. But if I deal with conflict, then it's basically like that iceberg is shrinking and it's getting smaller, and actually people are able to get closer and closer to us because we are dealing with things in a healthy way. And so here's what this means, and this is really important that you and I understand this. If we are participating in unhealthy conflict, whether we have the conflict or we're sort of coming alongside someone else in an unhealthy way and helping them be unhealthy, and we're making things worse. And so, when you and I take a conflict that we have with somebody and we take it to somebody who can't help, somebody who can't make it right, like, whether we call that gossip, whether we call that triangulating, whatever you want to call that. You take a conflict to someone who is not in the conflict, and that's sort of your first move. You're making things worse. You're actually furthering the divide. Because you're building this case and you're starting to get angry over here with this person about that person over there who may or may not even know that they've wronged you. And you haven't gone to them. And so if we do that, and we're making it worse. If you listen to somebody's conflict without pointing them back to the person and saying, hey, you need to get back over there and have a hard conversation. If we do that, then we are making the problem worse. If we're just sitting there listening and going, sort of adding, yeah, well, you were definitely right, and doing all those kinds of things, we're making it worse. One of the things that I do when I'm doing a wedding, often right at the beginning of the wedding, one of the first things I'll say is I'll challenge the people who were at the wedding. They think they're just there to watch, but I always challenge them to say, listen, will you commit with me that whenever this couple has conflict, because they're gonna, right? Whenever they have conflict, that you won't take sides in their arguments, but instead you'll push them back to one another. You'll force them back into each other's arms to be able to deal with that conflict. And I make the people in the room say we will. Now, whether or not they ultimately do, who knows? But at least I put that in their head because I want, and it sometimes feels awkward to start a wedding with conflict, right? To go, hey, this isn't always going to be awesome, by the way, right? But it's important that we do that because we have to know this is coming, right? And we've got to build the healthy patterns in order to go, how are we going to deal with the conflicts when they come? If you're choosing to ignore, to avoid, to pretend it's not there, you're furthering the problem. You're building icebergs. And I'm just telling you, you've got to have the courage, even if time has passed, to go to the person and be able to go, hey, you know what? I know it's been 6 months, but this thing's been nagging. And I should have talked to you sooner, But this is a conversation we need to have. And if you can't do that, then I'm telling you, you have got to forgive and let go and move on. Because you can't keep carrying that with you. You can't keep building the iceberg. You can't keep allowing that thing to grow. You've got to get to a place where you can let go of those things. And often, most often, that happens because you have a difficult conversation. So I just gotta encourage you to do that. So here's what happens when you and I have these conflicts. Or maybe somebody comes to you and confronts you and says, hey, this was really painful, what you did, or this really hurt my feelings, or whatever it is. I want to talk a little bit just about how to go through sort of seeking forgiveness. Just sort of some 4 little practical steps, because I think what happens is a lot of times, even those conversations of forgiveness and someone got wronged, if we're not careful, that can actually make things worse if we don't do it right. Because sometimes our apologies or our seeking forgiveness, like they have these other phrases attached to them that just make it worse. Like, you know what I mean? Like, hey, I'm sorry that you were offended, but like, what did I just tell you? Like, you had the problem, not me, right? Like you were offended, and I'm sorry that you're crazy because you were offended, but I was just doing that. And once again, we restate our position, right? Have we forgiven or apologized in any way? No, like we just made it worse, right? Like, because that person walked away and went, I don't think I feel any better. Like, in fact, like I tried to go to them and it just got put right back on me. Right? So 2 phrases you want to make sure you avoid: if and but, right? So I'm sorry if you were offended, or I'm sorry if you took that the wrong way, or I'm sorry, right? Like we say all these different things. Or the but is always followed by some excuse, some reason why what I did wasn't actually that, it was this, and you just took it wrong, and it was, right? And so we have to be really careful to avoid those 2 words. And so here's what I want to teach you. I learned this from a guy named Michael Hyatt, and this is 4 like really easy statements that he said he has just tried to build into his life when it comes to apologies and forgiveness. And here's what he says. The first one is this: I am sorry. Okay? I am sorry. Not I'm sorry if, but I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Right? And what that does is it's me going first. It's me coming to you and saying, I blew it. I'm sorry. Right? Like I feel bad about this. And that goes such a long way for someone to hear you apologize without the, all the disclaimers and all the things, but just a straight, I'm sorry. And when we follow that up with this second statement, I know that hurt. I'm sorry. I know that hurt. I'm sorry, I know that hurt. And what that does is it acknowledges someone's pain. Like, you may not have meant it that way, and you may not have intended that, but guess what? That's what they felt. And so we have to own it. We have to acknowledge, I'm sorry, I know that hurt. I know that the way that impacted you, that had to hurt. Right? Like, acknowledging someone's pain. And then the third step, I was wrong. And that's where we can own the fact that like we played a part in this, right? I'm sorry. I know that hurt. I was wrong. And this is tough because sometimes we know that conflict happened, but we still feel like what we did was right, or the decision we made was right, or whatever that is. And that may be true. So don't apologize for a decision that you think was right. But apologize for the fact that it hurt somebody. Apologize for the fact that someone got hurt in the process, or someone's feelings were put aside, or you didn't communicate it clearly enough to them, and so now they felt left out, whatever it is. I'm sorry, I know that hurt. I was wrong. Like, I should have come to you first before I announced that thing, or I should have done this differently than I did. Like, the decision it's there to stay. It was the right decision, but I know that hurt, and I'm sorry. I was wrong in how I handled it. I shouldn't have done it that way, or I shouldn't have dismissed you, or whatever, right? But we own, we take responsibility, and we own our part of it. And then finally, the fourth statement is this: will you please forgive me? Will you please forgive me? And what that does is it actually shifts the sort of power in the relationship to the other person. And it puts yourself at the mercy of them, and it says, listen, I'm in need of forgiveness from you. I need you to forgive me, and I was wrong. And so you have given that person now the opportunity to forgive you or not, right? And listen, in the real world, sometimes people's hurts are so deep that they don't want to forgive. And they may say no. And they may, get mad and continue whatever. But this is where we go back to that verse that said, if it's possible, as much as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone, right? And that's the part that you and I can do. We can go to someone and we can use these 4 statements and we can apologize and we can own our part in it and we can ask for forgiveness. And that's all we can do. We can't forgive ourselves. Somebody else has to do that for us. But if you're willing to do this, I'm telling you, you can walk away and live in peace with the whole situation because you have done everything that you can do to make it right. And here's what I would guess. At some point, that person will extend that forgiveness to you one way or another, that they will begin to understand, especially if you continue to live in the same state, if you don't pick up the hurt back again and 2 months later launch another grenade at them, but if you'll just live in that sort of peaceful, like we're good kind of mentality, then I believe that reconciliation is possible in those relationships. So this has sort of been, I feel, a part of each week that we've touched on, this conflict thing. And as I was looking back on our notes, like we had sort of touched on it or things that I wanted to talk about related to conflict that we ran out of time for. And so this week I just really wanted to sort of wrap the series up with that. But what I want to do now is just for a minute, take a step back on the entire series. And I just want you guys to think through like the iceberg thing. And we've been challenging you week after week to deal with the stuff, right? To deal with what's under the surface, to be willing to have, the conversations or be willing to own up to different things and to understand the ways in which our brokenness and our sort of iceberg stuff affects the people in our lives and the way it affects us. And you just need to know that our unresolved junk in our lives, it does affect people. It affects the people around us in massive ways. And it does build these barriers where other people can't get close. But ultimately what happens, and especially when you think about a church where we're a community of people who are doing life together and spending life together, or you can think about your family, and if one person in the family is not dealing with their anger in a very good way, I mean, it impacts the entire environment, right? Like everyone is feeling that. Recently, and this is, my wife has allowed me to share this story, so don't think that I'm doing this without her. Recently, what happened, we have 3 kids. My middle one, Joy, is like the one who, if anything gets hurt, it's probably her. And I think everyone has one of those kids who's a little more Band-Aid prone, right? Like whatever needs to happen. And so she's had a couple surgeries already from different things, but the other day we were on the trampoline, or they were, and she fell and she hit her chin, which split it open. And Kimmy was outside, and I was sort of in the kitchen, but I heard crying, and I looked at Kimmy, and Kimmy's like waving for me, which usually means there is blood, and I don't want any part of it, right? Like that's because Kimmy is she is not the kind of person who would ever be a nurse or anything like that. Anytime she has to give blood or even get a shot, they have to like clear out the place and lay her out on a cot somewhere for a while. I mean, it's bad news. When Joy was in the hospital once before, she was done with her procedure, and Kimmy, they invited Mom to go back with Joy, right? Because what else does a little kid in the hospital want but their mom? Well, like 3 minutes later, they come back and they get me, and by the time I get back there, she's on a cot as well, and Joy's on a cot. Like it's bad, right? Like it's really bad. And so we see, I go running out there, and I'm looking at Joy, and there's a lot of blood, and I'm immediately going, okay, I can see this needs stitches. So we're like, okay, so let's let's round him up. Let's get over to urgent care. And so we jump in the car, and I had put something on there to put some pressure, and so nothing's visible or whatever. And so Kimmy ends up in the back seat next to Joy, just trying to not look and just rub her hair and just make her feel good while we're driving to urgent care. And for most of the way, we're doing good. But as we get about a half a mile from the urgent care, I notice, like, I'm looking in the rearview mirror, and Kimmy is like head back and just kind of in a daze, and she's sort of like slurring words, and she's not really making sense. And she's like, oh, I'm not doing good, and I'm like, great, I've got one kid bleeding to death, and my wife is about to lose consciousness, and so she unbuckles, and we have taken one of the seats out in her van, so she lays flat in the van floor, right? So because she's afraid she's gonna pass out, and so we're there, and we get to urgent care, and she's like, I'm coming. I'm like, no, just stay. I don't need two people in there. Just stay here. And so I grab Joy and I go inside. Well, the rest of the story I hear later, right, from Hannah, our 10-year-old, who is in the van and who is now the oldest, most conscious person in the van, right? And so here is Hannah, who is, and Isaiah, who's 4, and Isaiah's playing, he doesn't know what's going on. But Hannah is watching mom, freak out, right? She is oh, no, doing this thing on the floor. And somewhere along the line, Kimmy has heard that if you're physically affected, that there's sometimes maybe a spiritual connection. And so Kimmy's I know that if I just call on the name of Jesus, I'll be good, right? And so she's laying there, now she's going, Jesus, 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 right? Well, Hannah, 10-year-old theologian, right, believes that mom is about to leave this life and enter the next one. And she is seeing and talking to Jesus, right? That he is there and mom is talking to him. And so she is thinking, oh my gosh, mom is about to die. I am here with my dad's inside. And it is she is so tense and freaking out. Of course, in a few minutes, she's fine and she's okay. It's okay, well, let's go inside. Well, Hannah is still like this, right? She literally just thought her mom was dying in front of her eyes, and we're all laughing, but it's okay, because counseling will pay for, will be good. I know that one day she'll be on a couch telling about the drive, right? It's a big moment. But here's what you and I need to understand. Listen, the iceberg stuff in our lives, the way that we deal with our emotions in unhealthy ways, deeply impact whoever else is in the room in our relationships. And Kimmy, in her inability to handle any kind of medical situation, caused untold trauma to our 10-year-old, right? And it wasn't intentional, but it was just her functioning kind of what's normal for her. And other people, I'm going to pay for this later, I think. Other people in the room are deeply, deeply affected. And you and I need to understand that it's not just about whether or not you learn to deal with your anger. It's about whether your kids understand that and know that you love them. It's not just about whether or not you learn to figure out conflict in your life. It's whether or not you can have a close relationship of any kind. And whether or not people have to deal with that at work, at home, wherever that may be. And this stuff, guys, it's not whether or not you choose to grieve or you just choose to stuff something down below, a loss. It's about a healthy habit that will ultimately affect and impact every person in your life. So guys, we've got to go beneath the surface. We've got to get to the deep stuff that we don't want to talk about, that we don't want to deal with, that we don't want to drag up to the surface. And here's what we got to understand. God is in the business of melting icebergs. This is what he does. He takes these deep, massive hurts that we've all experienced from families we grew up in, from habits that we learned in those places, from unhealthy decisions and relationships that we've had. And God begins to heal, and he begins to heat, and he begins to melt all that stuff so that he can get to a heart that's soft, not hard, not surrounded by layers of ice. I'm telling you, if you want to begin to understand God and you want to begin to follow him, you've got to be able to deal with this. Many of us say, yeah, I want to follow Jesus, but Jesus, stay away from this. I don't want to have to deal with this. I don't want to talk about this. I don't ever want to go back to that moment. I don't want to deal with the hurt that was in my past. I'd rather just stuff it and forget it. I don't want to have to forgive that person. I don't want to have to grieve that loss and dig it back up again. I don't want to deal with this stuff. And so we just add layers and layers and layers and layers. And pretty soon the closest relationships we have are way out there. And our families, our spouses, our kids are suffering as a result. They're wondering what's wrong with dad, what's wrong with mom. A wife is wondering what happened to my husband. Why can't we be close again? And there's these layers that have developed. And guys, if we're not willing to go back, if we're not willing to deal with it, we end up alone. We end up on these icebergs, these islands where no one can get close to us. And God is trying to penetrate. He's trying to do things in our hearts and our lives, but we're unwilling sometimes. Guys, this isn't just like, hey, a funny thing. This is maybe the most important thing you might ever do in your life. Is to go back and to begin to deal and to dig up stuff that you don't want to deal with, but to go through it and to go see a counselor and to talk to a pastor or to begin to forgive or to reach out. And I'm just telling you, your entire life, you may not even know how it's affecting you, but it is. If you'll get healthy emotionally, if you'll get healthy in the ways that you handle this stuff, your entire life could be changed as a result. And I believe that maybe Jesus wants to do things with you and in your heart that right now he's not able to do because there's just too many layers of hardness. And if you'll let him begin to deal with that, I think there's a whole new story for you. We say here, embrace the story you were meant to live. Well, some of us can't because there is an iceberg's worth of stuff that we're trying to move around and it doesn't go. But if we'll let God deal with that, then a whole new path opens up, a whole new story develops. Suddenly we can do the things that God has called us to do. And as a community, you just need to understand as a church, as the band comes, they're going to lead us, but as a church, you got to understand this. This is something we are committed to at Story Church. And so here's what this means, and this is maybe some of the weird things. A church that's committed to dealing with conflict, for example, has more conflict, right? Why? Because we're willing to have difficult conversations. And so it might feel messy and it might feel like, what's going on? But it's because we're willing to have those conversations rather than stuff them, rather than not deal with them or ignore them or pretend they're not there, that we're willing to have those conversations. And guys, we're just committed. I can tell you that the staff level, our teams, man, we have some hard conversations sometimes. And we look each other in the eye and we say, hey, that didn't go so well, or that wasn't good, or I'm not sure that we want to do that again, or hey, the way you handled that didn't really work. And that's not easy to do. I can tell you, I'm the first one. I would rather run from conflict. And I shared with you early in my leadership life especially, that's all I did. I ran from it. But if we're willing to step in, if we're willing to begin to deal with the icebergs, I just believe all kinds of health and fruits and all kinds of great things that God wants to do can come as a result. So let me just pray for you, and I just want to ask you with me, if you'll just close your eyes for a minute and just commit with me to allow God to begin to work in whatever ways he needs to work on our hearts. God, would you just come into our lives? And would you just confront whatever's necessary, God? We've all got stuff in our lives. We've got pain. We've got grief that we need to have. And we've got broken relationships that need restoration. God, we've got stuff we grew up with in our family, habits and patterns and secrets and things that we would rather not talk about. And yet, God, I just have the sense that you want to do so much more. And if we're willing, God, that you're able to melt away the ice, the layers, and give us a soft heart, God, a heart that can be used in huge ways. And God, that even in the midst of the deepest pain that we've experienced, that there's a flicker of hope there, God, something that pain could be turned into, to be used on behalf of somebody else, if we'll just let you. And so, God, I just ask in this moment that you'll give us courage as a people, as individuals, and as a church, that we'd be willing to do whatever it takes to be healthy, to be whole. And God, we invite your presence into our lives. We invite you to point out the things in us that need to be dealt with. And God, we commit ourselves together here today for the sake of our marriages, for the sake of our families, for the sake of the future. God, we want to be healthy and whole and move forward in those ways. And so, God, we invite you in. We ask you to convict us, to change us, and to give us a hope and a future. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.